Hi everyone, this is Lecture 12, Efferent Nervous System. So we're going to talk today about the pathways out of the nervous system, either to skeletal muscle through the somatic nervous system or to organs and glands through the autonomic nervous system. So again, we are finishing up the nervous system here, where it is the master controlling and communication system of the body. The nervous system is very specialized to quickly detect to and respond to stimuli. So we've talked all about how the nervous system detects stimuli through receptors, sends that information to be integrated into the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, and this is the last piece of the puzzle, which is the response. So the response is going to happen through the efferent division, and we call these motor responses. So these are the two different branches of the efferent nervous system. The somatic nervous system acts through motor neurons to contact skeletal muscle. The autonomic nervous system acts through two of its own branches, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, to contact smooth muscle in organs, cardiac muscle in the heart, glands, and some other hormonal structures. We are not going to have a chance to talk about the enteric nervous system until we get to the digestive system. Okay, so the peripheral nervous system is the efferent division, which are motor responses out. We've already talked about the afferent division, which is sensory information in. Both of these have branches outside of the brain and spinal cord, so they are called peripheral. So this includes both the nerves, receptors, and the synapses outside of the central nervous system. So what's happening in the efferent division is that we are going to get the information from the central nervous system, which has been integrated, to decide what kind of response should occur. This can be a very quick decision through a reflex, which will happen instantaneously, a very predictable, simple response, or this can happen through the more complex sensory pathways, going through multiple regions of the CNS to have more voluntary, coordinated, longer actions. And the motor neurons that can come out of the central nervous system will either be somatic, going to skeletal muscle, or autonomic, going to organs and glands. So we're going to first briefly go over the somatic nervous system. It's much simpler than the autonomic nervous system, and we will spend a little more time on the somatic nervous system when we also talk about muscles in a future lecture. So briefly, the somatic nervous system controls just skeletal muscle. It is voluntary, planned muscle movements, and we also have skeletal muscle reflexes that are considered somatic. So this includes posture, balance, and then the complex body movements that we all think about when we think about moving our skeletal muscles. So there will be upper motor neurons in the brain that will travel down and out either directly from the brainstem to some of the smaller muscles in the head and neck, that will happen through cranial nerves, or down the spinal cord and out the ventral region of the spinal cord to skeletal muscles throughout the body. So this will be from the neck down, coming out of the spinal cord. So how this occurs is that we have central nervous system control. We talked in the previous lecture about different regions of the central nervous system that are involved in motor control in different ways. But primarily, this is going to happen through the motor cortex, or the primary motor cortex coordination. There is also CNS control and coordination that happens through the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, kind of in parallel to what's happening and talking to the motor cortex. But primarily it's going to go from the motor cortex down through the brainstem and either out the brainstem to the head and neck muscles, or then down the spinal cord to the lower muscles. And there'll be a final motor neuron that originates in the spinal cord, exits the ventral horn of the spinal cord, and will then synapse or make a connection to skeletal muscle fibers. Hopefully by now this anatomy and reviewing the anatomy that was the prerequisite for this course, by now hopefully this anatomy is okay for you guys. So the synapse on a skeletal muscle fiber is a special type synapse called a neuromuscular junction. We'll talk more about how neuromuscular junction signaling happens when we get to the muscles lecture. But what you guys need to know for now is that the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine, and the receptor is called a nicotinic acetylcholine receptor. So the acetylcholine will be released from the axon terminal of that final motor neuron that's coming from the spinal cord. So this cell body would be in the spinal cord, and then the axon will be traveling out. Acetylcholine will be released and will make a connection to the skeletal muscle. The skeletal muscle itself will then have the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors on it to receive that chemical signal, and then an action potential can occur in the skeletal muscle to tell the skeletal muscle to contract. So several different motor neurons will exit out of a single region of the spinal cord, and this goes back to our mapping. So the mapping that goes up the spinal cord and creates the maps in the brain is also similar to the mapping that comes down the spinal cord. So go back to your sensory and motor homunculus. The motor homunculus is also mapped, and then each individual neuron that comes down will have a special target. And that target is going to be a group of muscle fibers within a group of muscles located in a particular region. So one motor neuron to a group of anatomically mapped muscle fibers is called a motor unit. And we'll talk more about motor units when we get to the muscles lecture. We've also talked about the corticospinal pathway. So this is where we've got your motor homunculus with your mapped out regions sending motor neurons down through the brainstem. They cross over to the other side. So this is contralateral control. So this is the left side of the brain controlling the right side of the body. So they're going to cross over at the medullary pyramids, travel down to the spinal cord, and then the final motor neuron will exit from the ventral horn of the spinal cord and go out to the skeletal muscle. So the corticospinal pathway is the major somatic efferent pathway that's pictured here, going from the brain, the cortex, to the spinal cord. That's why it's cortico for cerebral cortex, spinal for spinal cord. And then there's that final motor neuron going to the skeletal muscle, where it will then synapse and cause the skeletal muscle to contract and move. So the upper motor neurons are in the primary motor cortex. The cell body is in the cerebrum or cerebral cortex, and then the axon goes down. The spinal cord then has a lower motor neuron where the cell body is in the ventral horn. The axon will exit the ventral root of the spinal cord before it reaches the skeletal muscle. The skeletal muscle is the final target where acetylcholine will be released and the muscle will contract or move. So let's take a moment to draw out the corticospinal pathway so that you guys have a little bit of time to review. Okay, so the corticospinal pathway starts in the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex is the upper region of the brain. The cerebellum would be back here. And then the lower regions of the brain would be the brainstem before it reaches the spinal cord, and then the spinal cord will travel down the back. So up here we have the cerebral cortex. Does anybody remember which lobe the primary motor cortex is located in? I'll give you a hint. It's in front of the central sulcus. So here's our central sulcus, and the primary motor cortex is in the precentral gyrus, which is part of the frontal lobe. Okay, so here's our primary motor cortex. And remember that we also had motor association areas that help with the planning and decision making before it gets to the primary motor cortex. Okay, so from the primary motor cortex, we're going to have very specifically mapped motor neurons. So let's say we want to move the muscles of our fingers. We'll go to the specific finger mapped region of the motor cortex, and that will then travel down through the brainstem and down to the specific part of the spinal cord. From there, it's going to synapse in the spinal cord, and you will have a second motor neuron that exits out the ventral horn of the spinal cord. So this is going to be our upper motor neuron that originated in the cortex, and this will be our lower motor neuron that originates in the spinal cord, and that's how we get our corticospinal pathway. So the lower motor neuron exits out the ventral root of the spinal cord. If this is going to the muscles in our fingers, it's going to be part of the brachial plexus. If you guys remember, I know you have PTSD from anatomy, but if you remember back to your spinal cord branches, this would be the brachial plexus going to muscles in the fingers. And then we'll just draw our big muscle here. And the muscle will contain individual muscle fibers, some of which will get the innervation from that lower motor neuron. Acetylcholine will be released, and the muscle fiber will have movement, which is caused by contraction. We'll talk about the process of contraction in the muscles lecture. Okay, so from the corticospinal pathway then, this will be our major somatic pathway. Let's now compare the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system controls smooth muscle of the organs and cardiac muscle of the heart, which is also an organ, but it has specialized muscle type. These will be unconscious, so we cannot control them as much as we wish we could control our belly gurgles and our heart rate. We can't control them. They are unconscious organ level reflexes. The major control of the autonomic nervous system happens in the hypothalamus. It can then travel through brainstem, spinal cord, autonomic ganglia signals. So the major autonomic pathways for the autonomic nervous system are going to originate in the hypothalamus. So this picture is a little bit misleading, right? The hypothalamus is not within the cerebrum. They really should have sliced this and shown you guys a sagittal section so you could see deeper in the brain. So this will be deep in the hypothalamus where you'll have your upper motor neurons, or homeostatic. I'm going to call them homeostatic neurons so you don't get them confused with motor neurons of the primary motor cortex. They will then travel down either directly through the brainstem to go to the head and neck, or down through the spinal cord to go out to your other autonomic regions. So what's interesting about the autonomic nervous system is that you don't have a single lower motor neuron before you get to the organ. You'll notice there's another cell body here that's sitting out in the peripheral nervous system. So we had a cell body here where the upper motor neurons or the upper homeostatic neurons originated, and then a second cell body in the brainstem or the spinal cord. If this was somatic motor neurons, then we would be done, right? Then they would go to skeletal muscle. But actually, we then have a second set of neurons in the peripheral region that are located in groups of cell bodies called autonomic ganglia. That second set of peripheral neurons then is going to go to the organs. So we have brainstem or spinal cord after the hypothalamus, and then the next stop is not the organ. The next stop is an autonomic ganglion or several autonomic ganglia, where we then have the cell bodies of the final neurons, which will contact the organs. Another difference here is in the type of synapse once we reach the organs. So these are called varicosity type synapses, where we have very diffuse release to whole large regions of organs rather than an individual neuromuscular junction. So here is a picture. This is not from your textbook. This is from a different textbook, but I like it. Here is a picture of the type of varicosities that will be branching throughout smooth muscle. So instead of an individual neuromuscular junction or an individual synapse here, you have several diffuse regions where the neurotransmitter will sort of blanket an area with neurotransmitter. So your final neuron is a ganglionic neuron. We call them post-ganglionic neurons. That's going to stretch to the organ and release diffusely the neurotransmitter. So if we compare the somatic and autonomic nervous system, we have a couple of major differences. One is in the central nervous system control. Somatic nervous system is mainly controlled by primary motor cortex. Autonomic nervous system is mainly controlled by the hypothalamus. The somatic nervous system exits the ventral horn to the ventral root. The autonomic nervous system, if you go back to your anatomy, actually exits very close to the ventral horn, but there's an extra region, the lateral horn, to the ventral root. Or if we're in the upper regions, they will also exit the brainstem. The peripheral nervous system portion of the somatic nervous system, it goes directly to skeletal muscle. So once it exits the spinal cord, then we go straight to skeletal muscle. But the autonomic nervous system has a second stop. So from the spinal cord or brainstem, we then go to autonomic ganglia for the autonomic nervous system and then to the organs. The primary neurotransmitter for the somatic nervous system is acetylcholine. For the autonomic nervous system, it varies. Sometimes it's acetylcholine, and sometimes it's epinephrine, norepinephrine, and we'll talk about these variations soon. The final synapse for the somatic nervous system is the neuromuscular junction, and the final synapse for the autonomic nervous system is actually not a synapse at all. It's several diffuse varicosities for large regions or large release of neurotransmitter. So let's also draw out the autonomic nervous system on the same diagram we just did so you guys can compare them. Okay, so here's our same diagram, and I'm just going to draw it in a different color. And for this, I need to draw the brainstem out a little bit better. So remember, for the brainstem, for the lower brain regions, we had the corpus callosum, and then we had the thalamus right below that. Do you guys remember the thalamus? That's that relay station. And then below the thalamus, which we were calling sort of the cheeks or the nose of the seahorse before you get to the pituitary gland, here we have the hypothalamus. So you can only see this when you look at deep sagittal sections of the brain rather than the outer section or just looking at the cerebrum. So the hypothalamus is below the cerebrum, below the corpus callosum, and below the thalamus, and it's this region here. So this is going to be our primary control center, where we're going to have the major neurons that are going to travel down, and we'll talk about exactly where they go in just a minute. After this, we're going to talk in great detail about the autonomic nervous system. So these neurons are going to travel either down the brainstem or out to different regions of the spinal cord. I'm just going to draw them down here a little bit lower. And then we will have what we call a pre-ganglionic neuron exiting the spinal cord. Then, instead of going straight to the target, like the somatic nervous system goes straight to skeletal muscle, Then we're going to have a second neuron that is located in a lump of cell bodies we call a ganglion. And that then is going to be the final neuron that goes, I'm just going to draw a heart here, that goes to the organs. And we call that the post-ganglionic neuron. Okay. So for somatic, we have primary motor cortex going down the spinal cord and out to the skeletal muscle. For autonomic, we have hypothalamus going down the spinal cord or brainstem to a preganglionic neuron, to a ganglion, to a postganglionic neuron, and then to the organs. So we're going to spend the rest of the lecture now on the autonomic nervous system. There are a lot of details, as you can see, that are important for the autonomic nervous system. And really, when we talk about clinically, a lot of medications, a lot of diseases, a lot of problems with homeostatic control are going to act through the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is very important for those of you who are interested in clinically related careers to understand. So it is part of the efferent nervous system. It's going to control the response of organs and glands. So its major functions, again, are the involuntary regulation of homeostasis. And to do this, it'll control responses in cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, glands, and actually also adipose or fat tissue. So let's look more closely at the general anatomy of the autonomic nervous system. It's going to receive input from the central nervous system regions, hypothalamus. It'll then send efferent signals through two different neurons to the organs. So here's that final neuron exiting the central nervous system. This will be your preganglionic neuron that will reach the autonomic ganglion outside of the central nervous system. And then this is your postganglionic neuron that is going to contact the effector organ and release neurotransmitter diffusely to affect the organs. So we also need to understand that there are two opposing branches of the autonomic nervous system. There's the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Each branch is even more different anatomically and functionally than what I've shown you. And they differ in the following ways, which we're going to draw out and talk about. They have different length of pre- and post-ganglionic axons. They have different location of those ganglion we've talked about. They have different neurotransmitters for their postganglionic neurons. And the organs contain different receptors to respond to these two different branches. What that means is there are different functional effects within the target organs based on the receptors that the organs contain. So here we are again. We have a preganglionic neuron going to the ganglion, where we have neurotransmitter released there. Then we have a postganglionic neuron going to the organ, where we'll also have neurotransmitter release. So let's first talk about the anatomical differences. So the sympathetic nervous system has short preganglionic neurons that exit the lateral horn of the thoracic and lumbar spinal cord. Do you remember which the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord are? Okay, think about it for a second. I'll show you a picture in a minute. So thoracic is going to be in the chest region. Lumbar is going to be in the lower back region. So these are going to be thoracic and lumbar originating preganglionic neurons. The ganglion then, or those clumps of cell bodies, are going to be located near the spinal cord. And there are two types for the sympathetic nervous system. There are sympathetic chain ganglia, and then there are collateral ganglia. Then they will have long axon postganglionic neurons to the effector organ. The parasympathetic nervous system is actually the opposite. So they're going to have long preganglionic neurons, and they are actually going to be originating from cranial nerves. cranial nerve 3, cranial nerve 7, cranial nerve 9, cranial nerve 10, and the sacral spinal cord. We will then call these ganglion terminal ganglion, and that's because they are the preganglionic neurons are so long that the ganglion are actually in or near the effector organ. So if you go back to your anatomy and you try to find your sympathetic chain ganglia and collateral ganglia, you will find those. You'll find pictures of them. You'll remember models of those. But the terminal ganglia, you won't find them because they're in or near the effector organ and they get hidden by the organ itself. You will then have a very short axon to the postganglionic neurons to the effector organ because these are already within the effector organ. They don't have far to go. Okay. So let's draw this out too. Okay, so for sympathetic nervous system, I'm now going to draw the spinal cord and the bottom of the brainstem. It looks like a necktie. Ignore that it looks like a necktie. For the sympathetic nervous system, we're going to have, so let's draw this first. So we've got brainstem. Then what are your regions of the spinal cord? Do you guys remember? What's the one in the neck? Cervical. Yep. What's the one in the chest? Thoracic. And then the lowest region of the spinal cord is going to be lumbar. But don't you have vertebrae after that? Yeah? Okay, so remember that the spinal cord then continues to have nerves that stretch down to the legs, and these will be your sacral region. Okay. So for the sympathetic nervous system, we're going to have short preganglionic neurons that are originating from the thoracic and lumbar spinal cord. So your cell bodies for the sympathetic nervous system are going to be located in the thoracic and lumbar region. So this I'm going to abbreviate sympathetic nervous system. And these are going to be very short axons. They're short axons because the ganglia, or the collections of cell bodies, are very nearby the spinal cord. They look kind of like little beads on a string traveling very close to the spinal cord. So these are going to be your sympathetic nervous system ganglia. And then you're going to have cell bodies within those ganglia that are going to stretch all the way to their target organs. Okay, so for the sympathetic nervous system, we're going to have short preganglionic. So I'm going to write short pres and long postganglionic that are going to go all the way to the organs. And note that the preganglionics all originate in the thoracic and lumbar spinal cord. So these are thoracolumbar region. So that is sympathetic. Now parasympathetic is going to be basically, well, everywhere else. So these are going to be originating from the cranial nerves that will be located in the brainstem. Do you guys remember your cranial nerves? So go back to your anatomy and look up your cranial nerves, and what you will find is that we have certain cranial nerves that have autonomic input. So these will be your cranial nerves that have autonomic autonomic output, and their cell bodies will be located in the cranial nerves, which are located in the brainstem. So some on the medulla, etc. Okay. From there, they're going to have very long preganglionic axons. Very, very long. So these super long preganglionic axons are going to stretch almost all the way to the organs. And then you will have ganglia, which we call terminal ganglia, actually inside the organs themselves. And for that reason, these postganglionic neurons, you almost can't even see them. They're going to be so tiny right inside of the organs. But they are there. So those will be the ones originating from the brainstem, which will be your cranial origination. We also will have some originating in the sacral spinal cord, so they'll be down here. So you'll have nerves coming down here. You're going to have long preganglionic axons again, and then very short postganglionic, because you'll be in the organs at that point. So, are you going to have cell bodies in sacral nerves? No, but these are going to be sacral nerves that have originated in the lumbar spinal cord. Okay, so very different anatomically, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Your book draws it out this way, which maybe is a bit better than my drawing, but if we don't do it slowly, I think sometimes these diagrams get very confusing. Okay, so for the sympathetic nervous system, we have thoracic and lumbar preganglionic that will go to the ganglia, and then postganglionic that will go out to the various target organs. So here's all your target organs. For the parasympathetic, we will have cranial, nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10, going out, stretching all the way to the target organs, and then very, very small terminal ganglia and postganglionic neurons once you're in the target organs. That also goes for the sacral spinal cord, or sacral spinal nerves. This is from another book, but I like it as well. So if you guys like to use this diagram, it's available in your PowerPoints also. So in addition to anatomical differences between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, we also have chemical signaling differences. So the sympathetic nervous system has two different neurotransmitters. The preganglionic neurons will have acetylcholine, and the postganglionic neurons will release norepinephrine. The parasympathetic nervous system is all acetylcholine. Do you remember what the somatic nervous system releases? Acetylcholine. So the easiest way to remember this, if this gets confusing to you guys, is that everybody's acetylcholine except the target release at organs, or the postganglionic neurotransmitter for the sympathetic nervous system. So when the organs receive norepinephrine, they know that came from the sympathetic nervous system. Everything else is going to be acetylcholine, and if the organs receive acetylcholine, they know that came from the parasympathetic nervous system. So here's the sympathetic nervous system diagrammed out, now with the neurotransmitters specified. So here's your preganglionic neuron going to your ganglion, which will be very close to the spinal cord. That preganglionic neuron is going to release acetylcholine. And then here's your postganglionic neuron, which has a very long axon that'll go all the way to the organ and release norepinephrine. I like this diagram as well because it shows each parasympathetic and sympathetic regions and the different neurotransmitters being released. So here's the cranial part of the parasympathetic nervous system, which stretches all the way to the organ, terminal ganglion, and releases acetylcholine. Then a short postganglion, another release of acetylcholine. Then here's your sacral division, which is going to originate actually in the lumbar spinal cord and then go through the sacral nerves, go to the terminal ganglion, release acetylcholine, and then have a postganglionic neuron that will release acetylcholine actually onto the organ. The sympathetic nervous system will be thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord, where we'll have short preganglionic that are going to go to the ganglia, and then long postganglionic that'll go to the target organs. The adrenal medulla is going to be an exception, which we'll talk about in a minute, but once you get to the target, you will have norepinephrine and epinephrine being released. Your book has a summary table for this too. So, autonomic activity affects entire organs. It's a big difference between the autonomic and the somatic nervous system. So, somatic nervous system is just going to be a couple of muscle fibers in the whole muscle. If we consider a muscle to be a whole organ, that's just a tiny subset. Whereas the autonomic activity is going to be very diffuse release, and the whole organ will change. And this is due to the postganglionic anatomy because we have these very diffuse synaptic varicosities from the autonomic nervous system spread throughout the target organs, which will have diffuse release. Often, this will also be compounded by the fact that target smooth muscle and cardiac muscle is connected functionally by gap junctions. So when you have a change in one cell in an organ, it gets spread very quickly through all the other cells. So each organ as a whole is controlled independently. There are many functions of the autonomic nervous system. So now we're going to get into the differences in function between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. But overall, what they are doing is controlling cardiovascular activity. So this is the heart, the blood vessels. Body fluid chemistry, we can change the chemistry of the body by the activity of certain organs, for example, like the kidneys. Osmolarity, we can affect thirst, we can affect the water content of the body based on blood pressure and things like that, blood volume. Lung activity or pulmonary activity through breathing rate, through the opening and closing of the airways. Digestive activity or gastrointestinal activity, so motility along the digestive tract, so contracting digestive organs will move things along and enhance digestion, or we can slow down digestion. And then other reflexes, so for example, visceral reflexes such as micturition, which is urination, defecation, and then sexual reflexes. And then finally, stress. So the autonomic nervous system can stimulate various hormones to cope with stressful situations, but overall, we'll see that the sympathetic nervous system is primarily active during times of stress. So let's talk then individually about function, starting with the sympathetic nervous system. And I love this picture. It's so intense, right? It's not from your textbook. It's from a different one. But this is the system that is dominant when the body is preparing for activity or stress. So I don't know if this guy is fighting with you or if he's like your drill sergeant, right? But either way, you've got some stressful situation. So physical activity, stress, feeling threatened. Typically, this is talked about as running from the bear. So what you want to think about for the sympathetic nervous system is, what does the body need in order to respond to a physical threat? What do you need to do and prepare in order to appropriately respond to running from the bear? And here's what you need. You need to be able to run, right? So you need to increase blood flow to your skeletal muscles. So to do that, you want to increase your heart rate, increase the force of contraction of the heart, and increase blood pressure to get more blood to the muscles. We also need to get more oxygen in that blood that's going to the muscles. So we need to open up the airways and get more oxygen into the bloodstream. We will also, since we're running away, we need to assess the situation as a whole. So think of this as, you see a bear, you run, but you need to keep aware of everything around you. So we're going to increase our distance vision. And in order to do that, we need to bring as much light as we can into the eye. So we're going to open up and let the light in and dilate the pupils of the eyes. We also need to increase the metabolic preparation for those muscles to be able to function. So we're going to increase the release of blood sugar and fat. We'll also increase sweat to anticipate the excessive heat production that occurs when you increase that running or increase activity. So the sympathetic targets then will have appropriate responses based on the sympathetic function. So sweat glands are going to increase secretion to cool the body down. Erector pili muscles, those are tiny muscles in the skin, will cause goosebumps. Cardiovascular system will increase blood flow to the brain, heart, lungs, muscles, and skin. But we're going to decrease blood flow to unnecessary functions, urinary and digestive system. We will increase heart rate, contraction of the heart, and blood pressure. The respiratory system will increase airflow. The digestive system will decrease activity and secretion, so the digestive system is going to stop, while the cardiovascular and respiratory systems are going to turn on. They're going to break down nutrient stores in order to get more glucose into the body. Skeletal muscle will increase the force of contraction and increase the release of acetylcholine for that contraction force. Adipose tissue or fat tissue will increase breakdown to get more nutrients into the body that can be used quickly for metabolism. And then the urinary and reproductive systems will generally decrease. So the urinary system will decrease urine output, but reproductive, and this is very interesting, and we will get to the anatomy of this, but it's actually the sympathetic nervous system that is responsible for the male ejaculatory reflex. So in addition to the normal output of the sympathetic nervous system, there is a second connection that the sympathetic nervous system does, and this is to the adrenal medulla. So the timing and intensity of sympathetic nervous system response is enhanced by neurons that leave the lateral horn and go out to this gland and this particular region of the gland called the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla is an organ or a gland that releases epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. So think about last time you had a very, very stressful event. How long afterwards did you feel stressed, right? I always think about this for, when I was in school, when you get really stressed for an exam, right? It takes a while. Even when the exam is done and you get home, you still kind of have that time where you feel that stress before everything finally settles down. Well, you can blame your adrenal medulla for that long-lasting effect because you'll have the immediate effects due to the direct innervation of the organs, but then you're going to have this release of epinephrine, norepinephrine, into the bloodstream that's going to be long-term effects because it's now going to be in the blood and traveling throughout the body. So the adrenal medulla enhances the epinephrine and norepinephrine effects at all sympathetic targets by acting through the bloodstream. So it is located just above the kidneys, and it's the specific part of the adrenal glands at the middle, or the adrenal medulla. So epinephrine is considered a neurohormone because it's both a neurotransmitter and it's being released into the blood. And what it's going to do is reinforce through the diffuse spread of epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood. The outside of the adrenal glands are totally unrelated, although they are related to the stress response, but they release steroid hormones, and we'll talk about that more when we get to the endocrine system. So again, here's the adrenal medulla getting innervation from the sympathetic nervous system and releasing epinephrine into the bloodstream. So we'll have direct effects of the sympathetic nervous system from the short preganglionics to the long postganglionics and then to the targets. And then from this special release through the adrenal medulla of epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream, and that can also reach the targets. Parasympathetic. So the parasympathetic nervous system is the rest and digest nervous system. It is dominant when the body is quiet and relaxed. So I think of this as sort of the housekeeping functions. And if you want to think about what the parasympathetic nervous system is doing, you want to ask, what does the body need to do to replenish, to refill, to recycle, to reset? So what the parasympathetic nervous system is generally going to do is to conserve energy. It's going to decrease heart rate, it's going to decrease the force of contraction of the heart, and it will constrict the airways because you don't need them to be open. It will increase digestion. It'll increase, in general, secretions of the digestive system, mucus, saliva, digestive secretions. It'll increase digestive motility, and it will open up the digestive sphincters, or open up the regions across the digestive system to allow the digestive system to move forward. It will also be adjusting for near vision. So if you're no longer running from the bear, you could now hunt for your, you could now focus on gathering berries, right? So you're constricting then your pupils and looking at things very close to you. Okay, because now you have the time and the energy to pay attention to what's very near you. The last part of the parasympathetic functions are preparation for sexual activity. So this is again a replenishing type function. So it will increase blood flow to the erectile tissue. So when we go into the reproductive system, you will see that the anatomy of the male erection reflex happens through the parasympathetic nervous system. It will also increase apocrine sweat glands, which are located in the armpits and the genitals for that nice, stinky apocrine sweat. The targets of the parasympathetic nervous system will then make sense for their function. So lacrimal glands, so these are the tear ducts, or the tear glands in the eyes, will increase secretion. The cardiovascular system will decrease heart rate, heart contraction, and blood pressure. The respiratory system will decrease airflow, just to conserve energy. The salivary glands will increase secretions. The digestive system will increase secretions, activity, motility, and nutrient storage. So it will favor the buildup of nutrient stores like fat tissue and glycogen and things like that. The reproductive system will then also increase secretions, and then that is where the erectile reflexes will happen. Also have a chart of the effects of sympathetic and parasympathetic stimulation in your textbook that you may want to look at as just a summary diagram. So what's interesting about these two systems is that most organs are innervated by both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So what you can think of is that the sympathetic nervous system is the accelerator. This is the one that's going to turn things on and get things moving. So get your body moving to respond to stress. So muscle moving, heart pumping, high heat. Very active. That's the sympathetic nervous system. And then the parasympathetic nervous system will be the brakes. It's going to be active during times of rest and digest. So there will be competition between the two systems depending on the state of the body. So the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system baselines will be different in every organ depending on the overall function of that organ. Is that a group of organs or organ systems that are important for a fight or flight response? Or is that a group of organs that are important for rest and digest? So one example is the example of the heart, where you will have sympathetic innervation to the heart and parasympathetic innervation to the heart. And you can actually see in the action potentials or the electrical activity within the heart that stimulates a heartbeat, the differences that occur through sympathetic versus parasympathetic stimulation. So you have slower action potentials and fewer of them that will initiate heartbeats in the parasympathetic. So you'll have slower heart rate when the parasympathetic nervous system is dominant. And you have more action potentials and faster action potentials when the sympathetic nervous system is dominant. And that will increase the heart rate. There are some cases where the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system are not battling it out, and this is when you only have one system innervated. It's interesting. There are no organs that have only parasympathetic. All of these organs that have single innervation are sympathetic. So there are several examples of parts where you only have the stress response. So the liver, fat tissue, adipose tissue, blood vessels, and sweat glands only have sympathetic nervous system input. So how do you get increased or decreased activity in the liver and the blood vessels, for example? Well, how that happens is by increasing or decreasing the frequency or the individual activity of the sympathetic nervous system. So there is a range of sympathetic activity that can happen. So a little bit activity will have a lower response, whereas a lot of activity will have a higher response from the sympathetic nervous system. So when the body is in a rest and digest mode, the sympathetic activation to these organs will be off or very low. And when the body is in a stress mode, the sympathetic activity to these organs will be very high. And that's how they can tell the difference. So increased sympathetic activity, for example, will constrict the blood vessels, whereas decreased sympathetic activity will dilate blood vessels. So in general, the sympathetic nervous system will tighten up or contract blood vessels. And then you turn off the sympathetic nervous system and it will open up or dilate blood vessels. So how does this actually happen if you only have two neurotransmitters responsible for all of the sympathetic and parasympathetic changes at all of the organs? So go back a couple slides and look at all of the different things that are happening during the sympathetic and parasympathetic responses. Some organs will go up, like for example, for sympathetic, the heart rate will increase, while some organs go down. So for example, for sympathetic nervous system, while the heart rate goes up, the digestive system will decrease. So how do you get with the same system and the same neurotransmitter, how do you get one organ increasing and one organ decreasing? And the answer is the receptors in each organ. So even though the sympathetic nervous system always releases norepinephrine, the receptors that are located in the digestive organs compared to the receptors that are located in the heart are very different. So even though the stomach will get norepinephrine and the heart will get norepinephrine, the norepinephrine itself inhibits the stomach and activates the heart. So this happens because of different receptors. So first, acetylcholine binds to cholinergic receptors. There are two types of cholinergic receptors. There are nicotinic receptors and muscarinic receptors. You will find nicotinic receptors at all ganglia. So the preganglionic neurons always release acetylcholine to nicotinic receptors. And that's the case for the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. You'll have preganglionic, acetylcholine, nicotinic receptor. Preganglionic, acetylcholine, nicotinic receptor. It's the postganglionic to the organs that are different. So for the parasympathetic nervous system, we're releasing acetylcholine to different organs. And those organs will have specifically muscarinic receptors. Muscarinic receptors then can also vary. So this can go on forever, guys. So the specificity that can happen here is also within the subtypes of nicotinic and muscarinic receptors. But nicotinic receptors are always excitatory. That's why they're always located in the ganglion. So the nicotinic receptors will always relay the message to the postganglionic neurons. It's within the organs where you have muscarinic receptors where you can have different effects. So sometimes muscarinic receptors are excitatory and sometimes they're inhibitory. So we have a postganglionic neuron going to an organ, and you'll have various types of muscarinic receptors, some of which will be excitatory and some of which will be inhibitory. Are you lost yet? Yeah, I know. So the reason that we have all of this specificity is so that we can get all of these different effects in the target organs. So again, ground yourself in what is the goal of this nervous system. So if we're talking about muscarinic receptors, we're talking about acetylcholine release at the target organs. Which system releases acetylcholine at target organs? Parasympathetic. So if we want to know what the different muscarinic receptors are doing, think about what are the parasympathetic effects on those organs. So for the muscarinic receptors, you will have muscarinic receptors in the heart and muscarinic receptors in the stomach. What does the parasympathetic nervous system want to do to the heart? It wants to slow it down. So the muscarinic receptors in the heart will be inhibitory. What does the parasympathetic nervous system want to do to the stomach and other digestive organs? Right, it wants to excite digestion. So the muscarinic receptors in the digestive system will respond to acetylcholine in an excitatory manner. Okay, yeah, we need to draw this out. Okay, so for parasympathetic nervous system, we're going to have cranial and sacral origination of your preganglionic neurons. And then those are going to go all the way to the terminal ganglia and release acetylcholine. Within the terminal ganglia, then you have the cell bodies of the short postganglionic neurons. Those postganglionic neurons are going to have nicotinic receptors. So acetylcholine being released to nicotinic receptors at the terminal ganglia. That is always, I'm just going to write a plus sign, excitatory. The postganglionic neurons then that are going to the organs are also going to release acetylcholine, and the effects of acetylcholine are going to depend on the receptor. So the target organ, let's say the heart or the stomach, these are always going to be acetylcholine to muscarinic, but the effects will depend on that specific muscarinic subtype that's in the heart and in the stomach. The effect on the heart will be inhibitory. The effect on the stomach will be excitatory. Do I want you guys to memorize every specific type of muscarinic receptor in every specific organ? No. But I want you to know that it's always muscarinic receptors for the parasympathetic nervous system at the target organ. Sometimes those muscarinic receptors cause inhibitory interactions. Sometimes they cause excitatory interactions. So how do they do that? The nicotinic acetylcholine receptors are going to cause excitation by opening cation channels. Mostly, the main effect will be to allow sodium into the neurons or the target neurons. So at both sympathetic and parasympathetic preganglionic to postganglionic synapses, we will have excitatory effects through nonspecific cation channels of the nicotinic receptor. For the muscarinic receptors, these are going to be at the organs on target cell membranes, and the reason you can have some inhibitory and some excitatory effects is because it's not going to act through sodium or cations entering. It's actually a more complicated G protein coupled receptor interaction. So these are going to happen through second messenger cascades, and then the specific effect or the phosphorylation of proteins and the various cyclic AMP and other interactions that can happen downstream of the muscarinic receptors will be variable based on what's inside the cells of those organs. Okay, so that was parasympathetic through the cholinergic receptors at the organs. And now let's go through adrenergic receptors, which will be norepinephrine and epinephrine at the organs for sympathetic. There are various, of course, right? Why would this be simple? There are various types of adrenergic receptors, which we title alphas and betas. So there are alpha 1 and alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, beta 3. They're numbered, but don't get confused here. So I have a lot of students that see the big A in adrenergic and think that these are acetylcholine receptors. So right offhand, I want you guys to write this out. Norepinephrine and epinephrine go to adrenergic. Why? Because the common name for epinephrine is adrenaline. And that's where the adrenergic comes from. So under epinephrine, I want you guys to write adrenaline. So these are adrenaline receptors or adrenergic epinephrine receptors. These are going to be located at the target organs for sympathetic nervous system. So if they have the ones, alpha 1 or beta 1, they will have excitatory effects. If they have the 2s and 3s, alpha 2, beta 2, beta 3, they will be inhibitory effects. And again, if you're feeling lost, go back to the bottom line. What do these organs want to do, or what does the sympathetic nervous system want to do to these organs during the fight or flight response? So for alpha 1, we're going to increase the activity of most target organs. But we'll have alpha 2 on digestive organs. What does the sympathetic nervous system do to the digestive organs? It decreases them. It's going to shut down digestion, close the sphincters, decrease the secretions. So the digestive organs are going to have alpha 2s and be inhibited by the adrenergic response. The heart is going to have beta 1 receptors. So beta 1 receptors are going to increase the heart, so we get all that blood pumped to skeletal muscles so that you can run away from the bear. The blood vessels are going to be inhibited, and the airways will be inhibited by beta 2 receptors. Why are we inhibiting blood vessels and airways? We're not inhibiting the blood vessels or the blood flow. We're inhibiting the smooth muscle in the blood vessels and the airways. So in other words, when we inhibit the smooth muscle, we're going to open up or dilate the airways. The other part of the sympathetic nervous system will be mostly the alpha receptors, and that will be contracting the blood vessels overall in the body. And by contracting the blood vessels, we're going to increase blood pressure. Then the final inhibition will be not just digestive, but also urinary. So we'll be inhibiting urination by relaxing and reducing the activity of the bladder. So this will happen then through second messenger pathways. So generally, we will have G protein coupled receptors for the adrenergic receptors. And then depending on the specific effect of those G protein coupled receptors, we can have excitatory or inhibitory effects. In most cases, if it's excitatory, it's going to increase calcium second messenger pathways. If it's inhibitory, it can block cyclic AMP. But there's one weird one where sometimes increasing cyclic AMP can inhibit. I know, you guys, there's no one way to memorize all of this. The best way to memorize all of this is to know the alphas and betas are for adrenaline or epinephrine. And then you want to ask, when I'm in this specific target organ, what does the sympathetic nervous system want to do by releasing adrenaline to this target organ? And then if you forget, think about what adrenaline does to you. You get that rush of adrenaline, right? So you're going to be pumping your heart. You're going to be increasing activity. You're going to be blocking digestion, okay? Opening up the eyes, dilating the pupils, opening up the airways so you're breathing more, right? So these are all the adrenaline effects through the alpha and beta adrenergic receptors. So neurotransmitter effects can be excitatory or inhibitory based on the receptor type they bind to. So here's an example of epinephrine contacting blood vessels. Epinephrine to skeletal muscle acts through beta receptors and will dilate or open up skeletal muscle. Epinephrine through intestines can activate the alpha receptor and will constrict intestinal blood vessels. So epinephrine can bind to different isoforms of the various adrenergic receptors. So epinephrine to a beta receptor dilates blood vessels. Epinephrine to an alpha receptor constricts blood vessels. And what that will do locally is cut off the blood flow to the intestines and open up the blood flow to the skeletal muscle locally. Remember, this is local because the systemic effects overall to the blood vessels in the body are going to be constriction to increase blood pressure. That's something that we'll talk about when we get more to the cardiovascular system. But locally, we want to get more blood flow to the muscles, less blood flow to the intestines. We're going to cut off the flow to the intestines, open up the flow to the blood vessels, and that all happens through different receptor interactions. All right, here's the heart example. The heart has both sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation. Epinephrine will be released to heart muscle. Acting through the adrenergic receptors will get increased heart rate, increased force of contraction. The parasympathetic nervous system, acting through the cranial nerve 10 or the vagus nerve, will release acetylcholine to heart muscle, and acting through muscarinic receptors will decrease heart rate. So during stress and exercise, we will increase sympathetic activity to increase heart rate and other effects of the heart, and decrease parasympathetic activity. There are localized and widespread effects of these neurotransmitters. The parasympathetic will be localized and short-lived because you're going to have just the preganglionic to postganglionic interaction. Acetylcholine will also be quickly destroyed by acetylcholine esterase, which we'll show you when we get to the muscular system. The sympathetic effects are going to be longer lasting. Why? Because of the adrenal medulla. So you're going to have the pre- and post-ganglionic sympathetic interaction, but then you're also going to have epinephrine released into the blood, which will be a long-range effect. So I'm including some summary figures to help you guys make sense of all of this. Okay, but let's draw our last sympathetic to receptor pathway so we can compare with the parasympathetic. Okay, here is our parasympathetic pathway that we already drew out, right? So this is cranial sacral, where the spinal cord or the cranial neurons are going to release, going to be your preganglionic, releasing acetylcholine, and then your postganglionic are going to release acetylcholine to your muscarinic at your organs. And then for the sympathetic nervous system, we're going to have thoracic or thoracolumbar neurons, where the cell bodies will be in the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord, and they're going to have short preganglionic fibers that are going to release, I almost wrote norepinephrine. They're going to release acetylcholine. Okay, remember, everybody's acetylcholine except for the target organs. So they're going to release acetylcholine at the sympathetic ganglia, which can be your chain ganglia or your collateral ganglia. And then you have your long postganglionic, which will release the only different one, norepinephrine, to your target organs. And that will be, we'll say, heart. And there's your stomach. The receptor here are going to be your adrenergic receptors. And you can have alpha or beta adrenergic receptors. What does the sympathetic nervous system want to do to the heart? The sympathetic nervous system is going to excite the heart. What does the sympathetic nervous system want to do to the stomach? It's going to inhibit the stomach. Then the last piece is what neurotransmitter is located here at the sympathetic ganglia. That one is the same as the terminal ganglia, and those are going to be nicotinic. And that is going to be excitatory. So always excitatory at the ganglia, excitatory or inhibitory at the organs, depending on the neurotransmitter and the neurotransmitter receptor. So finally, we have autonomic integration in the central nervous system. This output is controlled by various centers in the brainstem and the hypothalamus and the spinal cord. So the hypothalamus will control the medulla and coordinate the autonomic, somatic, and endocrine responses that will then be sent out through the brainstem and the spinal cord. So here then is your hypothalamus, which is located deep within the brain below the thalamus and just connected to the pituitary gland. We then have various regions in the brainstem that will have specific autonomic activity before they send out the final cranial and spinal nerves to go to the target autonomic organs. So here's a summary of somatic versus autonomic, and hopefully we've drawn enough out that you guys can go back and review this summary. I suggest that you take a moment now to pause and draw the somatic nervous system, draw the sympathetic nervous system, and draw the parasympathetic nervous system just as we have done all together, but make sure you are able to fill in the anatomy, the receptors, and the various neurotransmitters and effects at each organ. So the reason that we need to understand this clinically is that there are many medications that are designed to obtain various effects on target organs. So if you block the sympathetic nervous system, then we can decrease the sympathetic response. Those are called sympatholytic agents. If we increase the sympathetic response, we can call those sympathomimetic agents, where they're mimicking the sympathetic nervous system. And then we can also have various parasympathetic and sympathetic enhancement and decreases. So some common drugs that you may even know people that are on these drugs. So have you ever heard of beta blockers? So beta blockers block cardiac beta receptors. Beta 1 receptors would normally be excitatory to the heart, increasing the sympathetic effect of the heart. But if you block them with beta blockers, then overall you will get a decrease in heart rate and a decrease in blood pressure. You can also have alpha blockers. Alpha blockers will block the sympathetic nervous system in the blood vessels, and they're used to treat high blood pressure. Another common medication, if you know anybody who has asthma, is albuterol, which is also called salbutamol. And this activates beta 2 receptors, which, when it does that, will mimic the sympathetic nervous system and open up the bronchioles. Nitric oxide is another common medication that is used to dilate blood vessels, which would normally inhibit, which would be inhibiting the sympathetic effect and inhibiting smooth muscle contraction. The last bit that I'll tell you guys, because I just find this interesting, is that as we get older, the efficiency of the autonomic nervous system decreases. In particular, the speed of the sympathetic nervous system decreases. So this can cause various effects. So this can cause low blood pressure, dizziness, and fainting. The lack of parasympathetic secretions can cause constipation, dry eyes, and this form of low blood pressure that occurs can actually be fairly dangerous and can cause dizziness and falling in the elderly. All right, enough information for today. Please take a moment to draw everything out and let me know if you guys have any questions.